Welcome to a Dual Digest podcast where two friends dive deep into the topics that matter.
From technology and AI to science, history, and global trends, we break down complex ideas and make them easy to understand.
Whether you're here for insights, entertainment, or just some good conversation, we've got you covered.
Just remember, stay curious, question everything, and keep exploring the world around you. And remember, every great conversation starts with a curious mind. Let's explore together.
Make sure to follow and subscribe.
All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we are diving deep into Mars colonization.
Ooh, exciting.
You guys send in a ton of awesome sources, YouTube videos from like the biggest names in space, some stuff from SpaceX's website, even some good old Wikipedia.
Wow, that's a lot to cover.
Seriously, it's like a mountain of Mars info. But don't worry, we're going to climb it together and uncover the most interesting bits.
You know, it's amazing that Mars colonization isn't just science fiction anymore.
Yeah.
It's actually becoming a real goal.
Right.
With SpaceX and NASA working hard to make it happen.
It really feels like it's everywhere these days. Everyone is talking about Mars.
It's true.
So what is it about this red planet that has everybody so captivated?
Well, there's the science of it all. Mars is kind of like a giant puzzle,
Ooh, I like that.
giving us clues about the history of our solar system.
Yeah.
Those huge volcanoes, the deep canyons, all the different minerals, they all suggest that Mars might have been a lot like Earth once.
And then, of course, there's the potential for resources. I remember one source talking about water ice under the surface. How would we even get to that and use it if we were living on Mars?
Well, scientists are coming up with some pretty clever methods, like they're talking about melting the ice with microwaves or drilling down and pumping it out.
Wow.
And once we have the water, we could use it for all sorts of things. Drinking, growing food, even splitting it into hydrogen and oxygen for rocket fuel.
Whoa, that's living off the land, Martian style.
Exactly.
So, it's not just about getting away from a messed up Earth.
Right.
It's about becoming a multiplanetary species, like pushing the limits of what humans can do. You mentioned the Kardashev scale before.
Oh, yeah.
Can you remind me what that is?
Sure.
And tell our listeners, too, of course.
Of course. It's basically a way to measure how advanced a civilization is,
Okay.
based on how much energy it can use.
So where are we on that scale right now?
Right now, we're at about a 0.72, still using things like fossil fuels and not fully using renewable energy. But if we get to be a Type 1 civilization, we'd be able to capture and use all the energy that hits Earth from the sun. Imagine that.
Whoa.
We could control the weather, build massive cities, and yeah, easily launch big space missions.
That sounds straight out of a sci-fi movie.
It does, doesn't it?
But before we get too carried away, we got to talk about the big issue, the distance between Earth and Mars.
Oh yeah, that's a big one.
I was watching Joe Scott's video, and he really put it in perspective. A round trip with the tech we have now would take 21 months.
21 months.
Can you imagine being in space for that long, whether you're on a ship or on Mars itself?
That's longer than any human has ever spent in space without coming back to Earth.
Right.
And it brings up a ton of challenges, mental and physical. Imagine the isolation, being stuck in a small space, knowing you're millions of miles away from everyone you know.
It's kind of scary to think about. And that brings us to another thing that came up in the sources, the health risks of being in space. Remember that footage in Daniel's video of those astronauts returning from the ISS after 6 months?
Yeah.
They could barely even walk.
Yeah, our bodies aren't really made for being in zero gravity for a long time. We're designed to live with Earth's gravity.
Yeah.
So when you take that away, your bones get weaker, your muscles shrink, your immune system takes a hit, you can have problems with your vision, even your heart can have issues.
We can't forget about radiation. That's got to be a huge problem, right?
Definitely. Out in space, beyond Earth's atmosphere, there's constant radiation from the sun and from cosmic rays.
Oh, wow.
And unlike a short trip to the moon, a mission to Mars would mean way more radiation exposure for a much longer time.
Yeah.
Figuring out how to shield astronauts from that is a major challenge.
Okay, so let's imagine we somehow manage to protect astronauts from all the dangers of space and get them to Mars safely.
Okay,
Then what?
right.
Where are they going to live?
Hmm.
The habitats, the buildings, it's not like they can just unpack and settle in, right?
Right.
What did you find interesting in the sources about Martian habitats and how they'd need to be designed?
Well, one thing that stood out was how important psychological well-being is. You might think it's all about protection from radiation and having enough air and water,
Yeah,
but you can't ignore the psychological effects of living in a confined, isolated place.
right.
Danely talked about proxemics, which basically means how the way spaces are arranged affects human behavior.
Okay, can you explain that a bit more? What does proxemics have to do with designing habitats on Mars?
Well, think about it this way. Even here on Earth, we have these unspoken rules about personal space,
Yeah,
how close we stand to each other, how much privacy we need.
right.
On a Martian habitat where you're living with the same people all the time, in close quarters, understanding those spatial things becomes even more important.
That's interesting.
Designers would have to create spaces that give people some privacy, but also have areas where everyone can come together.
Yeah.
They'd need to be really careful about things like sight lines, noise levels, and even lighting to make sure people aren't stressed and can actually feel good.
So it's not just about building a shelter, it's about creating an environment where people can actually live a good life.
Yeah, exactly.
Both physically and mentally.
It's about designing for resilience.
Yeah.
Creating a sense of community in one of the most extreme places you can imagine.
And that brings us to another point, I think. We were just talking about building an environment where Martian colonists can really thrive, not just, barely survive, but what would that actually look like? Like, what would everyday life on Mars be like for these people?
It's safe to say it definitely wouldn't be easy.
Yeah, not exactly a walk in the park. Or, should I say a rover ride on the Red Plains?
Huh, that's good.
But really, we're talking about a completely different world with, challenges we can't even imagine yet.
You're right. One source even compared living on Mars to living in a lighthouse or a submarine.
Oh, wow.
These totally isolated, self-contained places where people have to get used to a very specific way of life.
Yeah.
The same routines, not a lot of space, always knowing that there are dangers outside. It would take a special kind of person to handle that.
That makes you think, what kind of social structure would even develop in a place like that? Would we just copy what we have on Earth, or would something totally new emerge?
That's a question that's causing a lot of debate.
Yeah.
Some people think that a more top-down system would be needed at first,
Okay.
with a group of experts making the big decisions.
Hmm.
But then, as the colony grows and changes, they see it becoming more democratic.
That makes sense. You'd need strong leadership in those early years when everything is risky. But how do you make sure those leaders don't just hold on to power? Even when the colony is ready for more people to have a say.
That's the tough part, and there isn't really an easy answer. It would take a lot of careful planning and a commitment to transparency from the very beginning.
Right.
Maybe a system with term limits for leaders or a set of rules that clearly explains how power would be shared as the colony develops.
Yeah, makes sense.
Ultimately, any Martian society will only succeed if people are willing to work together, compromise, and put the good of the whole colony first.
It's like a huge social experiment, but on a whole other planet.
Exactly.
And speaking of experiments, how do we even start to tackle the basic things people need to survive on Mars?
Right.
Like food, water, air. We can't exactly run to the Martian grocery store if we run out of milk.
That's true. Self-sufficiency is key, and that's where the idea of in situ resource utilization comes in, or, as the cool kids call it, ISRU.
Okay, I gotta admit, whenever I hear ISRU, my brain kind of shuts off.
I get it. Sounds a little technical.
Can you explain it, in a way that even I can understand? I'm a space fan, but not a scientist.
Sure. Imagine you're camping in the middle of nowhere. You wouldn't bring every single thing with you, right?
No way.
You'd use what's around you, like gathering wood for a fire, finding water, maybe even finding some berries to eat.
Yeah.
Well, ISRU is basically that, but on Mars, we'd be using what's already there on the planet to keep ourselves going.
That makes so much more sense. So we'd get water ice from under the surface, like we talked about before. But what about food? Are we talking like Martian farms under these giant domes?
You got it. Building biodomes, these enclosed areas where we can grow plants from Earth and maybe even raise animals, is something scientists are really looking into.
Wow.
It would definitely take some serious planning and experimenting. But can you imagine fresh Martian strawberries for breakfast?
Now you're speaking my language. But we can't forget, not everyone thinks colonizing Mars is a good idea.
Right.
Some sources argue that we should be putting all our effort into fixing things here on Earth, not trying to escape to another planet. What are your thoughts on that?
That's definitely something to think about.
Yeah.
It's important to remember that going to Mars isn't about giving up on Earth. It's more about expanding what humanity can do and maybe learning things that could help us all.
Right.
Who knows what we'll find on Mars?
Yeah.
What new technologies will we invent trying to make it livable? These advancements could help us solve problems back here, like climate change and running out of resources.
It's like, a rising tide lifts all boats.
Exactly.
By pushing the limits in space, we might discover solutions that benefit both Earth and a potential future on Mars.
I agree. It's not a choice between one or the other.
Yeah,
It's about broadening our horizons, literally and figuratively.
I like that.
And, maybe going to Mars will make us appreciate Earth even more. How special and delicate it is.
That's a good point. And it brings up another interesting question. If we do go to Mars, who gets to go? How do we decide who gets that one-way ticket?
Oh, that's where things get really interesting and tough. It wouldn't just be about being physically and mentally strong, although that would be super important.
Of course. What else would we look for in these Martian pioneers?
We need people with all sorts of skills and knowledge: engineers, scientists, doctors, farmers, architects, teachers. The list goes on and on.
Wow, it takes a village.
It really does. But even more than just skills, we need people who are good with other people, emotionally intelligent,
Yeah.
and have a strong sense of purpose. People who are capable and kind, who can adapt, and who really want to contribute to something bigger than themselves.
It's like putting together a crew for a starship. But instead of going where no one's gone before, we're going where, hopefully, lots of people will follow.
Exactly. And just like a starship crew, these Martian pioneers would need to be a real team,
Yeah.
overcoming problems, working out disagreements, and being there for each other through good times and bad.
Okay, so let's imagine it. We have our crew, they've trained hard, they're strapped into their spaceship. What do you think that first landing will be like? What emotions will they feel when they take their first steps on Mars?
I think it would be a historical moment, like the culmination of years of dreaming, planning, and pushing what humans can do.
One source mentioned that the first Martian habitat would probably be sent ahead of the crew, so it would be ready for them when they arrive. Can you imagine the relief they'd feel, knowing that after that long, tough journey, they have a safe place waiting for them on this totally new world?
Oh, absolutely. And then when they finally step out of that landing module and onto the surface,
Yeah.
it would be a giant leap for humanity.
It gives me chills just thinking about it, those first footprints in the red dust, knowing they're really on another planet, millions of miles from home.
They'll be seeing a landscape unlike anything on Earth. This vast, desolate beauty that will challenge everything they thought they knew and spark their imaginations.
And it makes you wonder, what will they discover on this uncharted world? What secrets is Mars hiding that we haven't even thought of? So we've talked about all the challenges and all the amazing things that could happen, getting to Mars, living there, and even building a whole new society. But there's this one big question we haven't really dug into yet. Who's in charge?
Yes, governance. It's one of the most interesting and complex parts of this whole Mars colonization thing. We're talking about creating a whole new civilization, right?
Right.
With its own laws, ethics, politics. It's a lot.
And you guys sent in some sources that really get into this, and I gotta say, there are some pretty wild ideas out there.
Oh, yeah.
Like one article even mentioned Elon Musk saying that SpaceX will basically make its own laws on Mars. Is that even allowed?
Well, that's something legal experts are trying to figure out right now.
Mm.
You see, that this thing called the Outer Space Treaty from 1967.
Okay.
Most countries involved in space have signed it. And it says no one country can own a planet or moon or anything like that.
Right.
But it doesn't really say anything about private companies.
So are we talking like a Martian Wild West? Whoever gets there first makes the rules.
It could happen, but I think it's more likely that countries will come up with new agreements as space exploration and colonization become more common.
Yeah.
One idea is to create a special international group, maybe as part of the United Nations, to be in charge of Martian governance.
That sounds like a good idea. You'd need some kind of system to make sure things are fair, to prevent conflicts, and to protect the interests of both Earth and Mars. But what about the way Martian society itself is organized?
Right.
What would that be like?
Well, some sources suggested a step-by-step approach.
Okay.
At the beginning, you'd have a council of experts from different fields making the important decisions.
Makes sense.
And then, as the colony grows and things become more stable, it could slowly transition to a more democratic system, with elected leaders and a system of checks and balances.
So kind of like how settlements were often governed in Earth's history.
Exactly, starting with a small group of leaders and changing as more people arrive.
But then how do you make sure that transfer of power happens smoothly and fairly? That's got to be tricky.
That's the big challenge. You'd need very clear rules and ways to do things right from the start to prevent those first leaders from becoming like a Martian elite who won't give up control.
It's like we're trying to design a system that avoids all the problems and injustices that have messed things up for humans for centuries.
It's a huge task, but it's also really exciting.
I agree.
We have a chance to learn from our mistakes and build a society that's truly fair, just, and sustainable.
So we've talked about the big stuff, the laws, the government, the structure of society. But what about just living on Mars day to day?
Yeah?
How will people deal with disagreements? How will they cope with the stress and isolation of being so far from Earth?
Those are crucial questions. That's why choosing the right people for this mission is so important. It wouldn't just be about their skills and knowledge, it would be about their personality and character.
So we'd need people who can handle being in tough situations.
Absolutely. People with strong interpersonal skills, emotional intelligence, a sense of humor, and a deep commitment to their community.
So not just astronauts and engineers, but also psychologists, people who can help resolve conflicts, artists, storytellers, people who can help create a culture on Mars, something that brings people together and helps them be resilient.
Exactly. It's about creating a feeling of belonging, a sense of purpose, and a shared identity in a place that could easily feel strange and hostile.
So we've covered a lot in this deep dive. The science, the tech, the challenges, the possibilities. We even got into the philosophical and political stuff that comes with colonizing Mars.
We did.
But at the end of the day, it comes down to this. Why are we doing this? What's the point?
That's a question everyone involved in this will have to answer for themselves.
Yeah.
For some, it might be about scientific discovery, the thrill of exploring a new world, the chance of finding signs of life, maybe even current life.
Yeah.
For others, it might be about making sure humanity survives,
Right.
having a backup plan in case something terrible happens to Earth.
And for some, it might be something even bigger,
What do you mean?
like expanding what it means to be human.
Oh,
The desire to push our limits, to start a new chapter in the story of our species.
it's probably a mix of all of that, and maybe even more that we haven't thought of yet.
Right. Mars colonization is not just about science and tech.
It's not.
It's a journey into the unknown.
Definitely.
A massive experiment that will push us to our limits, challenge everything we think we know, and make us face some really big questions about what it means to be human.
Well said.
So there you have it, our deep dive into the world of Mars colonization. It's fascinating, challenging, and totally awe-inspiring. We just scratched the surface, but hopefully this deep dive has given you a taste of what could be.
The journey to Mars is just beginning, and who knows what we'll find there. But one thing's for sure. The dream of reaching for the stars is still alive, and it's up to us to make it happen.
Thanks for joining us on this amazing journey. And remember, keep looking up.
Make sure to follow and subscribe.